is Guy Delcom. I am the director of pastoral care and the arts here at All Saints Dallas. So, yes, welcome to our church. We're happy to host Art House, and in a moment, this is tripping me up a little bit because I'm trying to figure out how to announce my wife, who runs Art House Dallas. So, anyway, welcome to the church here. Housekeeping, if you haven't seen on the way in, go out this door. Halfway down, there's a women's restroom and men's on this side. And of course, drinks are allowed in the sanctuary here. So if you want to go get a water or another beverage, that's fine as well. So this church, All Saints, has been a partner with Art House Dallas for the better part of Art House's existence and All Saints' existence, I think, here in Dallas. This has been a treasured partnership for Art House Dallas because it's amazing when a local church holds a value for the arts, not just as like some peripheral or ethereal value somewhere, but something that is believed to be formational in the lives of the people that go to the church. We have always valued that. Now we get to be a part of it on this side, which I love that. So anyway, you are here tonight if you just had a friend and they brought you here and you're not sure what's going on. My wife's going to tell you a little bit more about that. But this is our spiritual formation series. And when I say we, I need to switch gears and say this is Art House Dallas's spiritual formation series known as Origin. Very, very excited to have Professor Matthew Dickerson here, who's going to give a talk, and Marissa's going to say a little bit about him and a little bit about the program that Art House Dallas is. But I will open us in a word of prayer, and then my wife will come up, right? Bow your head with me, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the good gift that it is to gather together in a beautiful place with great people, great conversation, to think more deeply on the things that truly, truly do matter in our lives, the eventuality of mortality in each of our lives, and what that might mean and what that might speak into our present moment here and now, wherever we've come from. I do pray for a great time of conversation afterward also, and that these things would somehow glorify your name. Amen. All right, so friends, Marissa Delcom, Executive Director of Art House Dallas.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Guy. As Guy said, my name is Marissa Delcom. I'm the Executive Director of Art House. We are so excited to be here tonight. Guy mentioned this is the launch of our Origin series. So every year we focus on a new theme. If you were dragged along by a friend and didn't know what we're talking about tonight, it is mortality. So that is our theme for this year. I'm going to explain a little bit more about how the series will work in terms of the launch tonight and throughout the summer. I do want to say a quick hello. We have people joining us from all over the country. We also have our partner location in St. Paul, Minnesota. They are hosting a live stream at their building tonight in St. Paul. So hello to everyone near and far. This is going to be available to watch following this evening if you want to share it, if you want to send it to anyone as well. So for those of you who have never joined us before, we are a nonprofit. We serve and support hundreds of local artists each year through artist formation and community outreach. We primarily work in 4 areas. We work in the visual arts, writing, music, and most recently we're actually in process developing performing arts programming as well. So in the fall, if you know anyone in the performing arts, from filmmaking to theater to script writing, there will be opportunities to get involved. So we primarily work in those 4 disciplines. Central to our mission, we believe that creativity has the power to form a very thoughtful, united, and compassionate city. And so everything we're doing is really based on that idea. We operate out of 3 core areas. So in addition to the arts that you may remember as you leave tonight, think of these 3 things when you think of Art House: community, gathering together; formation, what is happening in your life? How are you being formed? What are you being formed by? And outreach. We go into underserved neighborhoods and we work with people who don't have access to the arts or exposure to the arts. So those 3 areas are core to everything we're doing. We serve and reach, so we offer about 70 events each year. So I mentioned we're serving hundreds of local artists. We're also reaching thousands of people. So nights like tonight, and then things like artist critiques. There are many ways to get involved. As I mentioned, this reader. So some of you may have already picked up a copy. Each year, we curate and develop this, what we call a meditative reader. Inside of here, there are 6 sessions, and every session has poetry and visual art, scripture, and prayer. Really exciting, too. Our friends at Every Moment Holy, they have gifted us prayers from their Volume 2 book that are in here. So just really beautiful. We're really proud of this, and you guys are the first to have it today. So please pick up a copy before you leave if you haven't already. And the way that these books work, so tonight is the launch. Matthew will take us through his session. We will meet during the summer. So discussion groups will go through this text together. You can talk about the text. You can go through reading groups with your churches, with your neighbors, with your friends. You can sign up online and be put into a random group. We have virtual groups. We have in-person groups. There is an opportunity for you. So groups will meet throughout the summer, and then we'll close on Wednesday, September 20th. We'll close out the series. So hope to see you again in one way or another. I want to say a quick thank you to All Saints Dallas. As Guy mentioned, we are so grateful to be here, grateful that they open up their space to welcome the community and to welcome the city. So thanks to All Saints. And finally, I did want to mention one other thing. So pick up a reader, yes. Figure out how to get involved. We have a ton of things coming up, as I mentioned, and would love to see you again soon. All right, I'm going to introduce Matthew, and we're going to kick off this night. Matthew is the author of numerous works of fiction and nonfiction on a variety of topics, including creative writing, fantasy literature, especially the writings, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, especially the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and more, philosophy of the mind, and trout and fly fishing. He is a professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. He co-directs the Northern Penn Young Writers Conference and was previously the director of the New England Young Writers Conference as well. So please welcome up Matthew Dickerson.
Thank you. Thanks, Marissa. Drinks are allowed. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I am excited to be here. I'm actually excited about the topic, which may be a little bit weird because I'm speaking about mortality, which may be not the most exciting topic in the world to speak about. But I do love speaking about Tolkien. And Tolkien has been one of those formative writers in my life, dating back more than 50 years, since I think I first read The Hobbit. I actually had the opportunity to do graduate work at Cornell University in Old English Language and Literature for one of Tolkien's former students. So I like to say that I'm Tolkien's academic grandchild. And if I had like 1/10 of 1% of his creativity, if that passed on to me as academic grandchild, I would actually be thrilled. But I think it's much less than a percent of a percent. But even though the topic of mortality may seem depressing, Tolkien has a tremendous amount of wisdom about this area. And he's actually, surprisingly enough, it was central to much of his writings. As we will see in the first slide, I'm not, by the way, just to let you know in advance, I hate bullet points, so I'm not a bullet point person. The reason I have slides is because I'm going to look at a lot of passages from the writings of Tolkien to see what he had to say about this topic. And I think it's easier to see them for those of you watching remotely. You'll just have to listen to this 4 or 5 times so you can hear all of these quotes. But I will read them all, so even if you can't see them or read them in the behind me, I will certainly read the passages. So this is a letter that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote to a potential publisher before the publication of The Lord of the Rings, after the publication of The Hobbit, describing what The Lord of the Rings was about. And listen to what he says. Anyway, all this stuff, by which he meant all of his writings about Middle-earth, the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, all of that writing, he says, all this stuff is mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine. With fall, and by the way, I don't mean the pretty colors in autumn in Vermont, though they are very beautiful. By fall, he means human sinfulness, human rebellion against God. So he's writing about fall and mortality, or sin and death, if you will. With fall, inevitably, and that motive occurs in several modes. With mortality, especially as it affects art and the creative, or, as I should say, sub-creative desire, which seems to have no biological function, and to be apart from the satisfaction of plain, ordinary biological life, and which in our world is indeed usually at strife. This desire is at once wedded to a passionate love of the real primary world, and hence filled with the sense of mortality, and yet unsatisfied by it. It has various opportunities of fall. Okay, I'm going to come back to that quote a little bit later, but notice this, what underlies it. Tolkien is saying fundamental to all of his Middle-earth writings, his life's work was an exploration of mortality, and in particular, an exploration of the impact of mortality on human creativity and art. So with that in mind, we should actually enter into his writings and expect to see him exploring at a deep level this topic. How does mortality impact us as creators or sub-creators, as image bearers of the great creator, as those who were created in the image of a creator? And not just mortality, not just death, but also the impact of sin or fall on our art and on our creativity. So again, key things, right? He says it's mainly concerned with fall. It's the central topic of his writings, with mortality and how it affects art. He also talks about the desires at once wedded to a passionate love of the real primary world. This would be a whole other talk on Gnosticism, on the idea that the physical world is not important, it's not good, that what matters are abstract ideas. And Tolkien is fully valuing the real physical world that we live in, suggesting we ought to have a passionate love for this world. I like to say that no art is abstract. There's a lot of non-representational art, but no art is abstract. All art comes to us through our senses, and all art is dependent, right, on the world, the physical world that we live in. So even non-representational art is not abstract. It's concrete. It comes from the real world. It comes to us through our physical senses. So I want to start, before we jump to Tolkien, I think we can actually go one more slide. I'm told that Tolkien, I've read that Tolkien was a horrible speaker, a brilliant writer, but horrible speaker. When he was giving talks, he would read his lecture notes and mumble incoherently. So you could only hear him if you were sitting in the front row. But one of his former students, W.H. Auden, described Tolkien as an inspired speaker of footnotes. Because apparently when he was speaking and mumbling, he would get this really brilliant, witty idea, and he'd step out from behind the podium, and he'd say something really brilliant and witty, clearly that everyone in the room could hear, and then he'd step back to his notes and start mumbling again. And some of those footnotes would appear in the published versions of his talks, and this is one. He says, I suppose my work is fundamentally concerned with the problem of the relation of art and primary reality. So I want to look together at his Middle-earth legendarium, and also at his autobiographical, allegorical fairy tale called Leaf by Niggle, and try to draw out of that writing some of these ideas of his profoundest reflections on art and creativity, and especially on mortality in the fall. But first I want to jump to Genesis 1, 1 to 3. So, in Genesis 2:17, we read, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you are not to eat, for the day you eat of that you are doomed to die." Now, that reading is from the New Jerusalem Bible, which I picked because that would have been the Bible that J.R.R. Tolkien would have read. Although he actually knew enough Hebrew that he translated the book of Jonah. He was actually on the translation committee for the book of Jonah, so he knew enough biblical Hebrew to have translated that book. And in this passage, one of the things that's interesting is this word "die" is the Hebrew word "muth." And I talked to my pastor who has a doctorate in biblical Hebrew about this, because what's interesting in this passage is the word actually appears twice. If you were to read Genesis 2:17 in the Hebrew, it would actually read, "The day you eat of that, you are doomed to die," like this dramatic, you were going to die, like a bad movie. And in Hebrew, that's a poetic device that can be used to emphasize a point. So most translators will translate the repetition of muth, die as surely die or really die or you're definitely going to die, right? That's the reality we all live in. We're all mortal. We will all die. But I think there's another understanding of this as well. It could be used as an emphasis, but it could also be understood as actually we will die twice. The day you eat of this, you will die, and you will die. You will die a spiritual death, and you will die a physical death. Which is precisely what the story of Genesis 3 tells us, isn't it? When Adam and Eve rebel against God, they die a spiritual death. They have a separation from God. And then they die a physical death. So when Tolkien is exploring this, you see that he writes, right, I'm interested in mortality and the fall. He's exploring both the impact of sin on art and creativity, that is of our spiritual death, as well as on our physical death of mortality. So even before we get to our physical death, our mortality, I want to explore together a little bit the impact of sin or of the fall, of that first death on art and creativity. So before I even do that, I'm going to compress 2 or 3 talks I've given into one slide as sort of a preface. I'm going to explore this in more depth tomorrow morning for those of you who are taking part in that. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've often in the church bumped into an idea that because humans are sinful and because all art is fallen, that art is bad, like that creativity and imagination are always evil. They're the work of the devil. And people will take 1 or 2 passages out of Scripture and try to justify that all human creativity is prideful and destructive and evil. So before I look at the impact of sin in Tolkien's exploration on art, I just want to make it clear that Tolkien had a very high value of art and creativity. So here's my 3 hours of talk compressed into a very short slide from 3 passages from J.R.R. Tolkien's writing. The first is from his autobiographical allegorical fairy tale, Leaf by Niggle. And the second paragraph of that story says, Niggle was a painter. Simple sentence. Niggle was a painter. One of the things I love about that sentence is that Tolkien doesn't write Niggle liked to paint or that Niggle occasionally painted, or painting was something that Niggle did, but rather Niggle was a painter. In other words, painting or creative expression was core to who he was as a human person. Art is not just something he did, but someone he was. He was creative and artistic by nature. And a little bit later in the story, when the main character, Niggle, is under trial, you might say. He's sort of facing a board of inquiry or a medical board. The voice defending Niggle, this voice of mercy, says he was a painter by nature. He took a great deal of pains with leaves just for their own sake. In other words, there's something valuable in his defense to say that he cared about art, and he cared about doing art well because doing art well was in and itself valuable. Not for some other motive, not to make money, not to do propaganda, but to care about art and creativity is in and itself valuable. One of my favorite Tolkien stories, and I think there's also quite a bit of allegory and autobiography in it, is from the Silmarillion. It's a story of the creation of the dwarves. And in Tolkien's mythology, the dwarves are created by this angelic being named Aule, who's waiting for the humans and elves to appear in Middle-earth, and he gets impatient. So he's had this vision of what human and elves are going to look like, and he decides he's going to create them on his own. And the creator comes to speak to Aule and says, you don't have the authority to do this. All you can do is make puppets. And Aule he's apologetic. He confesses. He acknowledges he's done wrong. But then he gives not just an apology in the sense of a confession, but an apology also in the sense of a defense. He says, yet the making of things is in my heart, from my own making by thee. And the child of little understanding that makes a play of the deeds of his father may do so without thought of mockery, but because he is a son of the Father. Which is one of the most profound defenses I've read of creativity. And in many years teaching in a very secular setting, I've had opportunities to do sort of a lot of defenses of the Christian gospel. And I found that one of the most powerful defenses is the reality of human creativity, because whatever else people deny, it's really hard to deny that we are creative beings. That creativity is fundamental to who we are. And yet if we are just complex biochemical machines, as so many people tell us, creativity is an illusion. Tolkien takes art and creativity seriously and tells us where it comes from. The making of things is in my heart, right? Because I am the son of my Father. He says that in essay form in one other work. In his essay on fairy stories, he writes, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image of a maker. So now there's my, whatever I said, 3-hour, 4-hour compression of Tolkien's defense of creativity and art into 3 quotes. We can now jump to sin. And I mean, a discussion of sin, we're not going to just jump into sin. Yo, you're so far ahead of me. You're good. So, what are the impact of fall? And I want to look at a few things that Tolkien said. One is misdirected creativity. So creativity and art, Tolkien would say, are good things, but they can be misdirected. And one of the places we see this is in one of his simplest works is essentially what started out as a children's story, though it grew into something more profound than a children's story, The Hobbit, where the narrator is first describing goblins. Now, goblins, the narrator writes, are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They are creative beings. They, like the hobbits, We're created in the image of a creator. Creativity is fundamental even to the goblins. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture. They make very well. Or they get other people to make to their design. Like even when they're not making them, they're creative. They can design these things. Prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. Notice what it says about goblins here, right? They are makers. They are clever. They design. They invent. They're ingenious. They are creative. But their creativity is misdirected, right? The impact of the fall. We use our creativity not just for good, not just for beauty, but we use creativity for evil as well. And Tolkien, as powerful as his defense was of the value of art, he recognizes that creativity can be misused. It's not only, though, in the evil of goblins that we see this. Even in the more, what I think of more noble or good or heroic peoples, including in the elves, we see this as well. From one of his letters, he writes about the impact of the fall on elves. And he writes in this, the elves became sad, and their art, shall we say, antiquarian. And their efforts all really a kind of embalming, even though they also retained the old motive of their kind, the adornment of the earth and the healing of its hurts. Okay, so Tolkien is saying the elves used their creativity in art for a couple things that Tolkien saw was good, right? Adorning the earth. And he even says art can be healing. I don't know how many of you have experienced that art can be healing. I certainly have experienced that in my life. I suspect most of you have also. Tolkien saw art not only as making beauty, but as something which heals us. But he also recognized that the way the elves' fallenness impacted them is they wanted to keep everything static, keep everything the way it had been, the way it was. They did not want change. And so they used their creative power to keep their kingdoms in the world stagnant, to resist the growth of other races as well, of other peoples. It was a sort of a protective, let's hold on to our power. I suspect there's something of a warning to the church in this as well. There's another impact of the fall also that Tolkien gets to in his writing, and that's creativity and possessiveness. And this is a harder thing. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, the desire of the sub-creative artist, he's speaking about the desire of the sub-creative artist, that is the desire to create, the desire to be, to express creativity, to make art. He says it may become possessive. This is from a personal letter he wrote. May become possessive, clinging to the thing made as its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the Lord and God of his private creation. So even the art which is made for good purposes, creative work that was intentionally done for what we might think of as for good reasons, artists can become proud of their work, possessive of their work. The fallen human nature of greed can apply even to those things which are good. Right? I think we often think of, human sinfulness or human fall as only like making bad things or the bad things that we do, but it can even impact how we view things which are good. The art itself may be good, but the artist becomes possessive. And that comes out in several places. One of the tragic stories in Tolkien's Silmarillion is the character Feanor. Fëanor is largely sort of responsible for the major fall of the elves in the first age of Middle-earth and Tolkien's mythology for Middle-earth. He is the greatest, perhaps the greatest elven artist of all the history of Middle-earth. And therefore, because he has so much creativity, has done the most evil of any elf in the history of Middle-earth. His mother was named Muriel, and we read of Muriel, she had surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, for her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. That's her elven tribe. Her son Fëanor, we also read, became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. He had tremendous artistic, creative abilities. Gifts that could have accomplished much for good. He's actually, among many, many other things, he was a creator of the Silmarils, which are the greatest jewels, after which Tolkien's The Silmarillion is named. He created Elvish writing. He created all sorts of many beautiful jewels. But we read about Fëanor. He began a long secret labor. He summoned all his lore, his power, his subtle skill, and at the end of all, he made the Silmarils. All who dwelt in Aman were filled with wonder and delight at the work of Fëanor. He has made something good with his creativity, and yet the heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things that he himself had made. Fëanor began to love the Silmarils with a greedy love, and he grudged the sight of them to all save his father and his 7 sons. He seldom remembered now that the light within them was not his own. So again, I'm wondering, many of you raised your hands or nodded when I said, how many of you have experienced the art as something which can heal us? But I also suspect that many of you have experienced people becoming possessive over art, even artists themselves, growing in pride and possessiveness over what they have created. The impact of the fall or of human sinfulness. The creativity itself is good. It's part of what we were made to do as creative beings made in the image of the great creative being. And yet our creativity can be fallen. Yet another example is the story of Turgon. And Turgon wasn't evil in the way that Fëanor was. Turgon was actually one of the great heroes of the first age of Middle-earth. Any of you who have read the Silmarillion may know his name. But for those of you who haven't, who have read The Lord of the Rings, he's like the great-great-great-grandfather of Elrond. So that can put it into context. Or the great-great-great-great with about 70 or 80 greats in there, grandfather of Aragorn, to put it together. Or if you want one more connection, the swords that Gandalf and Thorin find at the beginning of The Hobbit, they came from Gondolin, and they probably belonged to Turgon. Which is kind of cool, because when they show those swords to Elrond a little bit later, and Elrond says, oh, here are the swords you have, here's what their names were, he doesn't tell them they belong to my great-grandfather. Sorry, those are the weird things you get when you listen to somebody talk about Tolkien, who's spent 50 years teaching classes on him and writing about him. Do you know he was fluent in 65 languages? Did you know that? Unless you count subdialects, and then which jumps to about 95. He would learn a language in 4 to 5 days, to the point of like conversational fluency. You know what you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. Someone who speaks 3 languages. Someone who speaks 1 language, an American. Then Turgon pondered long the counsel of Ulmo, and there came into his mind the words that were spoken to him in Vinyamar. Love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart. And remember that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea, right? There's profound wisdom, isn't it? Love not too well the work of thy hands. there's an important little bit of wisdom for the artist. But Turgon was become proud. And Gondolin is beautiful as the memory of Elventurian, and he trusted still in its strength and in its secret and impregnable strength. Though even a Vala should gainsay it, they're the angels, even an angel should gainsay it. And at the last he rejected the bidding of Ulmo and refused his counsel. I have a sense that one of the things that Art House does really well, and one of the goals, is to foster community. And it's clear being here right now that that's something that's actually happening right now, and something that's going to be happening over the next several months. I hope a lot of you take part in this for the next many months, for what's starting tonight. One of the areas that that human sinfulness impacts art is in our fractured community, and how fractured community destroys and harms art and harms the creative. In Tolkien's letter that I quoted earlier to his publisher, Milton Waldman, he writes about the art and creative diaries. He says, "They seem to be apart from the satisfaction of plain, ordinary life, in which, in our world, it is usually at strife." Tolkien felt that deeply, that his great creative work was not really well supported by those around him. He was disdained by the community at Oxford University where he taught. Until the last 12 or 13 years of his life, his great artwork was not really valued. And I think we live in a culture that doesn't especially value art unless it's economically valuable. Our artistic desires seem to at times be at strife with, when he says ordinary biological life, I think what he's really talking about is the economic machine. The economic machine that feeds us and gives us our jobs. And that's so often at strife with art. Niggle was a painter. We read that sentence already. The next sentence says, not a very successful one, partly because he had many other things to do. How many of you who are artists in creativity and express creativity in different ways find that the daily demands of life, the daily demands of economics, of paying the bills, hinder your art? Okay, I'm going to raise both hands for myself here. In case you're wondering if you're free to actually put your hand up here. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a culture that was, or communities that supported art? His painting was too large and ambitious for his skill, and wholly unsatisfactory, and yet very lovely. The only really beautiful picture in the world, he says, as he thinks about his paintings. But as we go on, we read about his neighbor, Parish. Now, Parish and Niggle are the two main characters of this story. Many of you may know what the word parish means. In this story, it is a proper noun. It's the name of his neighbor. But the word parish is also a common noun, and it refers to a community, and especially a religious community. So Parish's neighbor looked at Niggle's garden. When Parish looked at Niggle's garden, which was often, he saw mostly weeds. And when he looked at Niggle's picture, which was seldom, he saw only green and gray patches and black lines, which seemed to him nonsensical. He did not mind mentioning the weeds, a neighborly duty, but he refrained from giving any opinion of the pictures. He thought this was very kind, and he did not realize, even if it was kind, it was not kind enough. Help with the weeds, and perhaps praise for the pictures would have been better. Sin, the fall, as it fractures community, also fractures the work, hinders the work of the artist. hinders the support that we might get in our creativity. So there's your quick little snapshot of the first death. The day you live it, you will die. You will die a spiritual death. You will also die this physical death. We are all mortal. That is if there's one, right, fundamental reality of the world we live in, it is that reality. Let's jump now to the impact of mortality, the impact of our physical death. The story Leaf by Niggle begins early on with a statement about Niggle. Oops. Are we still live? It could have been me. Niggle had a long journey to make, we're told near the beginning of the story. And a little bit later, a couple pages in, the little man had got to make a troublesome journey. The journey, I think, is not difficult to see when you read the story, is a journey of death. In fact, the whole story is a metaphor, an allegory of his journey into whatever comes after life. In fact, there's some pretty strong hints here. He gets sick. He starts on the journey after a serious illness. Somebody comes to pick him up in black. Somebody dressed in black comes to pick him up, sends him on a train, and immediately goes into a dark tunnel. So it's a pretty clear metaphor, this journey he has to make. And this is the reality we're told about Niggle from the start of the story. He had a long journey to make, a troublesome journey to make. When the driver comes to pick him up, the narrator says, "Oh dear," said poor Niggle, beginning to weep, thinking about his painting. And it's not even finished. "Not finished," said the driver. "Well, it's finished as far as you're concerned, at any rate. Come along." The tragic moment of the story, right? Niggle spent his life on this painting. And before it's finished, he's taken away on his journey. By the way, Tolkien considered the Silmarillion to be his great life's work. He writes about it as being the vehicle for his profoundest reflections. In the last 10 years of his life, in a sense, it became less and less finished rather than more and more finished. And he died before it was ever published. So it was somewhat prophetic when Tolkien's short story says this about his character Niggle. He has to begin on his journey before he's ready, before his painting is finished. There's something that's always bothered me in Tolkien's writing. I say bothered me in the sense that I've never quite understood it. There are several characters who are these great artists in his stories. And I think for many of you, whether your creativity is expressed in culinary ways, in cooking or in parenting, which is I think one of the great expressions of creativity, or in teaching, right? Another great place where creativity is so needed and so desired. Or whether it's expressed in something you might think of as sort of more traditional arts, writing or painting or photography or sculpture or theater or dance. One of the things I've experienced and most artists I know have experienced is the longer we work, the more refined and better our craft gets, right? I am a better writer now, I hope. I think I am at 60 than I was at 50. I'm a better writer at 50. I was a better writer at 50 than I was at 40 or at 30. My craft of writing, my art of writing continues to improve over the course of my life. And yet there are these characters in Tolkien's writing that seem to be able to do something once and never again. It happens frequently in Tolkien's writing with several different characters. And it's always bothered me, like, if they can make something great, my friend Phil, who's here, who drove me down today from Oklahoma, we are looking at talking about someone he knows who's this wonderful guitar maker, an artist with guitars. And one of the reasons he's a great artist now is he's been making guitars for years and years and years, and his craft, his artistry improves and gets better as he ages. I hope some of you who are artists have experienced that. And yet we see something very different in Tolkien's writing. Yavanna, one of the great creators in Tolkien's Legendarium, she created these two trees, and they're the central things and the images in Tolkien's The Silmarillion. The jewels, the Silmarils, get their light from these two trees that Yavanna made. And when the trees are destroyed, sorry for the spoiler for those who haven't read it yet, when those trees are destroyed, they ask Yavanna, can't you make more? Can't you do it again? You've made them once. Can't you create 2 more trees again for us? And we read, and Yavanna's response is, even for those who are mightiest under Iluvatar, there is some work that they may accomplish once, and only once. The light of the trees I brought into being within the world, within the created universe. I can never do so again. Feanor says something similar. He's asked, Yavanna says, if you could open up these Silmarils, release their light, I might be able to use that light to bring my trees back to life. And Feanor refuses. In his answer, he says, for the less, even as for the greater. In other words, for me, even as it was for Yavanna, there was some deed that he may accomplish but once only. And in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I could unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. So again, as I said, this has bothered me. It doesn't make sense in terms of artistic craft as I know it. But as I was writing about mortality for the book chapter, part of which is excerpted in the book that you were all given or when you came in, as I was writing that chapter, I began to see again and think again about that quote that I began this talk with in the Milton Waldman letter, that Tolkien is exploring the impact of mortality on creativity. And I think now I begin to understand what this is about. It's an expression of the limitation of our finitude, our mortality. Even for the elves who were otherwise immortal, death is an unalterable fact for us, right? The overall body of my work, my oeuvre, whatever that might be, will be completed someday. I will no longer be able to create. My eyes will grow dim. My memory will fade. My hands will grow weak. Only the one divine creator is infinite and eternal. All others are sub-creators, all of us. And until my mortality is replaced with eternal life, until my mortality is replaced with eternal life, I have to face the fact that there will be an end of my creating. Isn't that the great limitation that we all face? Whatever Tolkien may have been thinking, his tales of creation in the Silmarillion, I think, give voice to that limitation. And I think he was expressing that in these characters, Yavanna and Feanor. I can create something good and beautiful, but there's going to come an end to when and what I can create. There's a limitation. There is a finiteness to my creative life. And he may express that differently in the form of myth than I might express it now. Like I talked about my eyes growing dim, my hands growing weak, my memory fading. All the things that would hinder our creativity as mortality sets in. He's expressing it in a different way, but expressing it in a profound and beautiful way. There is a limit to what we can accomplish in our lives. We will not be able to continue to create the two great trees over and over again. And yet Tolkien also gives us this glimpse of immeasurable grace, even in the midst of this loss and mortality. At the end of Leaf by Niggle, after Niggle's death, when he comes into this heavenly realm, he sees the tree painting that he has worked on in his life and that was never finished in his lifetime. And it's been given primary reality. It's no longer a painting on a canvas. It's a living, growing tree. And he can now spend many more years taking care of it as a living tree, still painting it, as it were, but no longer limited by a paintbrush and a palette of paints. When he first sees it, we read in the story, before him stood the tree, his tree, finished, if you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Niggle had so often felt or guessed and had so often failed to catch. I imagine all of you artists out there, all of you creators, all of you story writers, all of you poets have had those moments where you had something you really wanted to express and you've just fallen short of it. Even if you produced something beautiful and good, you had something even better in mind. All the leaves he had ever labored at were there as he had imagined them rather than as he had made them. And there were others that had only budded in his mind, and many that might have budded if only he had had the time. There's one bit of that immeasurable grace, right? This eternal promise when the limitation of mortality is lifted. But there's even more to this immeasurable grace. Tolkien ends his essay on fairy stories with another glimpse of that grace. Without denying the impacts of the fall or sin on our art, without denying the impacts of our finitude, of our death, of our mortality on the art. He goes on to say, and he's writing about fairy stories, which is his own artwork. But what he is saying is really true of all our creative endeavors, of all of our art in any of its forms. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated, the creator, not the creator with a capital C, but all of us sub-creators. So great is the bounty with which we have been treated that we may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in creative art, we may actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet as at the last redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them, as man finally redeemed will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. The end of Leaf by Niggle, we're told after Niggle has departed and gone into the mountains, followed the great shepherd into the mountains, I'll just leave it at that. We're told that his tree was for many other people this place where they could come and be healed, and was always a pointer to the mountains. So even despite Niggle's finitude, his mortality, the way his community, his relationship with Paris had been fractured, by grace, his art is still able to have this profound impact on the world around them. We are the recipients of immeasurable grace, even in the midst of our mortality. And I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. They really stocked you with water. That's great. Would you like another? We still have 2 more.
You can have that one.
All right. Okay, friends, so really my job is to do this. My job is to ask a question or two. I've got 4. I'm not going to ask you all. I'm not going to ask you 4 because we will allow you to ask questions as well. So I'm up here to prime the pump, to give you cues and say, here's a question that I would love to ask. And to give you time to think about your question, I will start with one. Perhaps an interesting question to start with, as we consider finitude and as we consider mortality and as we consider each of our eventual end is that of time, right? And I'll just read this for the sake of being very precise. You write, a line stood out to me, and I want to read it, and then I'll have a question. Your line says this: if mortality makes our time precious, doesn't it also make more precious the fruit of our labors, which for the artist is their art? End quote. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between, or the tension perhaps, between idleness, a wasting of time or an inefficiency of time, and the importance of margin in each of our lives. So perhaps I'm asking about time and being present in the moment, and not being hurried along by this eventuality of mortality in our lives as it relates to our vocation. That was not the most precise question.
So I mentioned that the 2 main characters have common words as their names in the story Leaf by Niggle. Parish, the neighbor, of course, that the word parish refers to a community, or particularly a religious community. The word niggle, just as parish is a common noun, the word niggle is a common verb, although it's not all that common anymore, but it was more common in Tolkien's time. And to niggle at something is to find something that's not really important and spend a lot of time on it. And Tolkien is sort of, in his story Leaf by Niggle, is both an apology and an apology. It's an apologetic for the value of art, but it's also an apology, I think it's Tolkien's apology for his own niggling. That there were times that I think he felt like he wasted time. That's certainly something, I have struggled with. Times of rest and refreshment are really important to me in my creative life. Among other things, for example, the Sabbath rest is really important to me as an artist. I would highly encourage people to have meaningful Sabbath practices. That's a margin in our lives. It's one of the things that I think would free us from the possessiveness of our art.
Yeah.
Like if you can let go of a day where you have to be productive and consumptive and possessive, that's a freeing for you. So the Sabbath and other areas of margin in our lives are really important for refreshing us. On the other hand, when I pick up my phone and start reading dumb videos on Instagram, just dumb videos on Instagram, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Cat videos. Cat videos, okay. Well, let's just get right to what it really is. We're talking cat videos, right? I'm not really doing something which is a margin in my life, which is helping refresh me in any way. I am niggling away time, and that's time I will not get back. Yeah. Probably my greatest regret from childhood, well, I remember hearing Elizabeth Elliot speak many, many years ago, and she said she loves, listening to classical piano, and she was talking about being at a concert once and listening to a classical pianist and saying, I would do anything to be able to play piano like that, except what it takes. One of my biggest regrets in childhood is the hours I spent on watching television that I will never get back.
Yeah.
I mean, Gilligan's Island, that was good, but some of the other stuff.
Yeah.
No, to answer your question, I
think it gets at it. It gets at it really well.
I still have hours in a week, oh my goodness, I just spent 30 minutes looking at cat, whatever it was.
Yeah.
I'm not working on my book, and I will not get that time back, and yet I grieve at how little time I have to do the creative things I want. And even while I'm grieving at how little time I have to do the creative things I want, I'm wasting time.
Yeah, and plenty of writers, and perhaps this is part of your creative process or decompression within the process is walks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So productivity perhaps, or a value to the margin. Purposefulness to the margin, to let go of the project a little bit, to be human in the moment, to allow the tank to be filled back up. Cat videos don't really get you there, so
Nope,
perhaps a walk.
But fly fishing does.
Fly
or
fishing.
taking a walk with my wife and our dog through the woods behind our house.
Yep.
Right. That's something I'll kind of address a little bit tomorrow also. But yes, those are times when I'm being refreshed, that I'm being attentive, that I'm looking at the work of another great creator in the form of a flower, or the blossom, or a tree, or the bark of a tree.
And maybe just a quick follow-up, and if we have any questions, I'm happy to pause on my questions if you want. So commence coming to the mic if you do have a question. Perhaps it's a good sign of maturity of the creative, though, to have good margin and not cat videos. Where you're just idle in time, but you are proactively continuing, or you're being present still in the moment as a creative.
I think that's something an area where I have grown in 10 years, but still have more growing and learning to do. And I think part of it is honoring God and the gift that God's given me to use my time well. And by using my time well, I mean taking walks. Spending time on the river, spending time in a canoe on a lake, spending time in the woods, taking Sabbath days of rest, and also using my time well, not niggling it away.
Yep, that's great. Matthew?
So I literally just drove up straight from Baylor University, spending time with some 18-year-old artists in a chapel, and I asked them, I was anecdotally, all the artists that I know who get burned out want to go into medical professions. And I think it's because they don't think art does anything to heal the world, and that's what they want to do. And then I asked them, do they think it does? And one of them said, I would feel really weird if someone said that art saved my life. And I said, but if you were a doctor, would you feel weird if they said that surgery saved my life? And he said, no. How do we introduce ideas? How do we help people see that art has healing functions without reducing it to utilitarian functionality?
Yeah, I mean, part of the way I would answer that would be to turn around to the church and encourage the church to value art. Because I think if the people around us that we respect, that we listen to, that influence us, value it, it's much easier for us to value it. I mean, let me answer that question with another question, or with another example. Let's suppose it's not art that we're asking to value, but a person. 15-year-old kid who feels devalued. You can tell them all you want, you have value. But if they've been treated like expletive at home, it's really going to be hard for them to know that they are valued and loved. So how we act will probably have more of an impact on people. If we take time to spend with art, if we read poems and read stories and have paintings in our house, and we show sculptures to people, and we live to value art, to value creativity, I think we will be impacting people for them to see. Just like when you treat somebody with love and respect, you help them to know that they as persons are valued. So that would be a part of it.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Would be that answer. I think there's also, I would also deal with it with biblical examples of the importance of art. I mean, I would argue that if you pick up the Bible and you just randomly open it and put your finger down, you're far more likely to come into a story or a poem or a metaphor than you are into a bit of abstract theology. If we have lost the imaginative ability to enter into art and metaphor and understand it, we've lost the ability to understand the Word of God. So one of the things that art is going to do for us, that will save us, is train our imaginations. I'll give you one more because they're popping to my head as we speak. Right? I remember 2016, as the divide in the country, the divisiveness of the country was growing and growing, reading a report that 80% of people on both political extremes could not fathom how anyone possibly could have voted differently than they voted. 80% of people who voted for Trump couldn't understand how anyone could not have voted for Trump. And 80% of the people who didn't vote for Trump couldn't understand how anyone could possibly have voted for Trump. There was a complete loss of sympathy or understanding of other human beings. Imagination is a thing that allows us to enter into someone else's story and understand them. It was a failure of imagination, a failure of story and art. The very things that art teaches us is the thing that enables us to love somebody else. And I would definitely say love will save us.
It's great, thanks.
I love these questions because they
You're
give me a chance
gathering a line.
to think, because now I have something to go write about. Yeah, thanks for asking these good questions. Even if my answers are terrible, it's helping me to hear the questions because it gives me something to think about.
I don't know if this is going to be a cohesive question, so I'm going to try to.
My answers are not very cohesive,
Okay.
so we're
try to consolidate it. But,
we're in good shape.
you talked about developing your craft over time.
Yeah.
You're better at it now than you were at 50, at 40, at 30.
Yeah.
But that is the same craft over time.
Yeah.
Some of us, and including myself, struggle to find the craft.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talk about this bell curve that kind of follows mortality.
Yeah.
Where your craft evolves and grows and dies with mortality, right?
Yeah.
Or deteriorates with mortality. What about those of us who have these mini bell curves of a craft that you find passion in and satisfaction in, and then it dies, but not alongside your mortality or the way you're evolving?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you talked about some of the passages you talked about. It was the creation of the tree. I can't create the tree again.
Yeah.
But you associate that with with mortality and death.
Yep.
But it can also be the death of a passion or something that you care deeply about. But it could also be the growth or the birth of something new.
Yeah.
I'm curious, your thoughts in that space, because that's what I struggle with, finding my craft for a long term.
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is simply actually to affirm what you're saying is actually good and valuable. I would always be hesitant to make any sort of universal, this is how all artists work, or this is how all of our creativity comes. I think God brings us through brings different people through different seasons, and some of us go through long seasons of a long continuous trajectory. But I see no reason why God would work that way, the same way in everybody. And I've certainly seen lots of examples where God doesn't work that way, where God brings different ones of us through different seasons. And if you see the only purpose is to be, the really, really, really famous artist whose paintings are hanging in the Louvre, then maybe you'll see, well, that's not going to work. But if we see that our growth and creativity is something that God's doing to build our character, something that God's doing in our lives to teach us empathy, then each one of those seasons in and of itself is going to be important and meaningful in your life.
No, that helps. There, I don't know, visually mini bell curves that contribute to a larger one.
That contribute to a larger one, right? That develop our character.
Yeah.
That teach us something about who we are in God's image, who we are as God's beloved creature, what God's doing in our lives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you.
It's a long walk to the mic. You can.
I have to lower it. All right, here we go. Well, I'm trying to channel all my creative energy into crafting this question, so we'll see how it goes. I was struck by your comments about the characters that seem to be focused on the economic machine or just the facts of life.
Yeah.
And as someone who is paired with a husband who is the artist, I would most likely take the label as non-artist or non-creative. I think most of the message around that pairing or the fact of simply putting one person in one of those buckets is lighthearted, and we need each other to keep each other balanced, and without the other, we would die, that kind of thing. I'm curious, though, those, sorry, babe. But the way that it was put in these stories is much more significant than that. It has a very extreme weight to those that feel that burden. So I'm interested to hear how you would, the encouragement you would give or the charge you might give to someone who, whether it's by nature or by the realities of how they grew up or were raised, that feel more of that burden of the demands of life, the getting through life. What is your charge to them about embracing the role of art and creativity for them?
That's a great observation. It's a great question. I think two things pop to mind. One, I believe that all of us are creative. I don't believe that we're all artists in the narrower sense of that. And I gave some examples. I think there's tremendous creativity in parenting. I think there's tremendous creativity in teaching. And those are two examples. Creativity in counseling, creativity in pastoral work. These are all areas of creativity that I might not call art. So I think all of those things are valuable. And we all practice and nourish our creativity, but it may look in different ways. Running a house is really creative. So that's part of my answer. Second part of the answer gets back to Niggle and Parrish. And the other three talks that I would give if we had 3 more hours. Niggle was a farmer, a gardener. And yet what he did was very valuable. And the story suggests that, Parrish was not Niggle. Niggle was the painter. Parrish was the gardener or the farmer. He grew potatoes. He grew really good potatoes. And there's a sense that if their community had been healthy, they would have both supported and nourished one another. And Tolkien, in that story, if you read the whole thing, they're school teachers. A minor character, but he's there. There is the major character of the painter, but another major character of the potato farmer. And all of them are valuable to this culture, to this community. And had the potato farmer really done that work well and lovingly, it would have benefited Niggle, and Niggle could have benefited him as well. Like one of Niggle's confession later on is he was a little bit too snotty to actually help his neighbor learn to appreciate art, even as his neighbor never really helped him to appreciate how to grow things well. And it's wonderful at the end of the story because they end up working together. They end up coming together and taking care of the trees, and you realize that it says, had Niggle paid attention to Parrish's knowledge of plants, he would have painted a better tree. And so I think that's part of it as well. Like whatever your gifts are, those are gifts which nourish other people when used well and used in the sort of community that I believe we're called to live in.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
We're just knocking through my questions without even me having to ask them, so I love that. That's great.
Good evening. I'd like to ask a question that to some extent pushes back on your pushback on Fionor's comments of only being able to make a cimmeral once.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the relationship then between mortality and telos. because both, to some extent, serve as a limiting factor, as ultimately there is a mortal limit. One can work so much in this. But it seems to me that the creation of the Cimmerals, the creation of the two great trees, is something that is limited not by an inherent mortality, but by a perfection in creation that is achieved within that. And then the remainder of the mortal life is, to some extent, reflecting and expressing and deeper understanding of what you've done. So, for example, once the Cimmerals are made, you could make copies, I suppose, or try to, I mean, he couldn't make literal copies, but it is a copy. In the same way, once Adam is created from dust, God does not create other men or women from dust, but then expresses that received thing. And so when we think of mortality as a limit and a limiting factor, and to some extent a transition, with Niggle seeing the ultimate, I could say platonic image, but I'm not. That's once he sees through the glass. Once he stops seeing through a glass darkly, but sees face to face the tree, that was his inspiration for his work. I think we can see, and there's a question there. I think we can see that he had a telos. It was imperfectly recognized through mortality, but then for, say, the deathless elves or the ancient spirits of Middle Earth, without that limitation, they can find their telos without constant change. And I'm wondering if you see that as a tension, or if you see that as a tension, or you see that as a continuation, or if I'm just quite wrong in reading these as two different things pushing to the same area.
So, if I understand your question correctly, the first part of the answer I would give is the richest and best metaphors can mean multiple things at once that are not mutually exclusive. So I believe language has meaning, that all interpretations of language are not equally valid. But even while I say that, I think, again, good story, good metaphor can simultaneously contain multiple meanings, can be expressions of multiple things. And often the poet or the writer isn't even quite sure what they're doing when they do that, and what they were being inspired to do may unfold later. So it's certainly possible that Tolkien's metaphor of the Silmarils and the trees carried multiple meanings, right? You can read the story of the prodigal son as the story of the arrogant older brother, or you can read it as a story of the loving father, right? All of those are part of that same story, and I don't think one of them is correct and the other ones are incorrect. I think it's the profundity of that beautiful story to carry multiple meanings at once. It's certainly possible that Tolkien was doing that. Having said that, I think what draws me, through years of studying Tolkien to that particular understanding of that were twofold. One, he wrote explicitly, all my explorations were on the impact of mortality on art. That was a major theme. So if we really take seriously what Tolkien was saying, he was writing about mortality in art. That seems to suggest, okay, he's saying something profound about the Silmarils and the two trees about mortality in art, or mortality in creativity. The other thing is that, unlike, say, God, you've made the thing you're supposed to do and there's no reason to make something else. It's not that you can't make something else, there's no reason to. What Feanor and Yavanna say is they actually couldn't make another one. If the Silmarils were destroyed, and if suppose they were these perfect things, the reason they didn't make more is they'd already reached these perfect things. But if they were capable of making more, when they were destroyed, they would have. But the story tells us that they're incapable of making another tree or another Silmarils. And that's another reason why I think this is what Tolkien was exploring. That fundamentally, mortality is a limit. And he was looking for a way, even with elves, even with Yavanna, right, who's one of the angelic immortal beings, that all creative finite beings have a limit to what we can do. it's any interpretation I have of Tolkien's writing could potentially be wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah. Which is why I always encourage everyone to go back and read the works again yourselves.
Hello. Hopefully this is a coherent question. When art is confined to concepts that bring uncertainty or instill fear and doubt in others, but there's a beauty and a hope in the middle, should we discard this expression as a form of art that will harm the community? And how do we find beauty in the bad without the bad being the main takeaway?
Those are great, deep, profound questions about art, and a very coherently phrased
Oh, thank goodness.
question. Thank you. So Tolkien wrote about creativity helping the enrichment or the foliation of creation, and I talked about art bring beauty into the world. I don't think that all art has to be beautiful in the way we would normally look at beauty. There's a lot of tragic stories even in the Bible.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of sad stories. There's just sad stories in life. And I think in some way, a good role of art may actually be pointing us to that which is not beautiful so that we can see it more clearly, to giving us insight into that which is tragic, giving us insight into that which is which in all sorts of ways may be depressing. I think there are great artists who have shaped me by giving me eyes to see in new ways the horrors of the world. And without those artists, I may have a very false, shallow view of the world.
Yeah.
There's a slight tangent, but it may get at that. There's a writer that I've begun to really appreciate. I don't know anyone out there, Tish Harrison Warren. Her books, Prayers in the Night is one of her books. She actually now I think has a weekly column from the New York Times. And in Prayers in the Night, she talks about a lot of anger,
Right.
being unexpressed grief.
That's good.
And I think there is a tremendous need and value to be able to artistically express grief. And I think when churches don't allow that, we are not serving people well. And yet grief makes people uncomfortable. Expressions of grief and sorrow and lament make us uncomfortable, and a lot of people don't want to hear them. And yet I think we need artists who are able to help us experience and express that. And I think they're doing something powerful and important and needed in the church today.
I had a short second question, but if you don't have time for that, that's okay.
I love these sort of dialogues. The only thing I feel bad about is like I'm answering the question, because I bet there's a lot of people out here who have really wonderful answers that I would like to hear. And the only thing is I have this mic on my face, so I get to answer the questions. But I would like to hear your answer to that question. What is your answer to that question?
Well, I think it's a confusing concept because the meaning behind something is very important.
Yeah.
And if the meaning behind something is bad and the main takeaway is bad, then that's the feeling that you get in the end. But in the end, there's a hope in knowing that there's the bad and that knowing that there's grief and there's sorrow, and that's just a reality. But to know that that's not like the final answer is really the most important part in understanding that form of creative expression, that it brings a sense of hope into that darkness, because that sense of hope in the darkness is basically saying that yes, this darkness exists, yes, it is reality, but the reality of darkness doesn't mean that there isn't like a light or a source
Yeah.
or a meaning behind it. And just knowing that the focus doesn't have to be necessarily extremely good, because if you only have good, then you don't understand exactly if you're only knowing about the good, then like you don't know about the challenges that you can overcome to get to the good. Yeah, pretty
So,
much.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me just respond quickly in affirming this. J.R.R. Tolkien actually coined or invented a word. I don't recommend that we all go around inventing words, but he did speak 65 languages, so I'm going to cut him some slack in inventing a word. The word he invented, which now appears in the dictionary, is eucatastrophe, which means the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. And he says, to see or understand the eucatastrophe doesn't deny sorrow or loss or ruin. In fact, the understanding that those things exist is necessary to the joy of deliverance. He says what the eucatastrophe denies is final absolute defeat. So our lives and our world are full of defeats.
Yeah.
And when we understand that, then the joy of the victory is that much greater.
That's true.
And what he denies is universal, in his words, universal final defeat is what he denies. So, second short question?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. How do we remain persistent in the creative, knowing that as mortal beings, eternity will not contain our creative endeavors we have on earth?
I would disagree with the last premise.
Oh, no.
I think eternity will contain our creative endeavors.
Yeah. It wouldn't contain the physical of our creativity.
So I think the fundamental promise of Christianity is not an eternal soul. The eternal soul is not the central promise of Christianity.
Right.
The resurrected body is a central promise of Christianity. And because of that, because I believe that our eternal destiny is as resurrected bodies in a physical world, that we will continue to have work to do. So I suspect that art will continue, creativity will continue, but it will be different, just as our bodies are different. I don't know what it will look like. The only thing I think I have a lot of confidence in about art and eternity is that it won't be limited by mortality.
Yep.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, we can do one more quick question, and then you're going to hang around for a little bit. So not long, but a little bit. So if you have a question that you're not going to ask in the mic, I'm sure you can come up and ask a quick question.
Can I put in a little plug in?
Yeah.
I have a few books out there.
You do?
My book, The Mind and the Machine, what is it? What are the title of the book? The Mind and the Machine, What It Means to Be Human and Why It Matters. Yeah. Chapter 5 is an exploration of Tolkien's defensive creativity. All the books out there, I bought them, so if you want to pay me for them, I'm happy to let you pay me for them. But also happy to if there's a book out there you want, you don't have money with you, you think it would be helpful to you, you're welcome to take it. You're not welcome to take it, bring it home, and throw it away. But any book you're going to read, if you want to take it, you can. If you want to give me money, you can. If you want to PayPal me, you can. But I don't write for them. I'm in a nice position. I don't have to write for the money. So I really mean that from the deepest bottom of my heart. You're welcome to take any of those books that you'd like. So there you go. Feel free to grab one. Yep.
You said something when you were talking about the elves becoming sad.
Antiquarian was Tolkien's term.
Yeah, and so I think it's a really pressing issue for the church and our sort of ongoing responsibility to be patrons of the arts. How do we balance, our sort of modern fixation with nostalgia, with the sort of inverse of that, which is doing something new for the sake of, new without necessary regard to the old. And if I can use maybe an example, I recently went to the Kimbrel in Fort Worth and was really struck by this statue of the Virgin Mary that was made out of hammered silver. It was commissioned by a nobleman for his parish church, where everybody who was wealthy and not wealthy would be able to see it. And I was so struck by how beautiful it was.
Yeah.
And then I thought about the last time I saw a church commission something, and I kind of thought, there's this beautiful statue that is shared by people of multiple positions in life, and now we sort of, we're really into like fog machines and, so but that's
Fog
not to
machines are
say,
cool, though.
well, right, but that's what I'm saying. Like, how do you balance that, the tendency towards nostalgia with the kind of
So first of all, your
creativity
question
of
actually
us?
gets back to one of the first questions that was brought up. Like, if churches were commissioning art and showing the art, it would probably help people who grew up in that church to understand that that art was valued and creativity was valued and not give up on it. So that's one of the things I mean by saying churches should value art. In some way, my answer is really just going to be to rephrase your question. Right there, there's a couple errors that you can follow in either one. Both sorts of forms of ageism. One is to say anything old is not valuable; only new things are valuable, and the other is to say nothing's valuable unless it's old. And I think both of those are wrong, right? Maybe the battles that go on over music in churches is one of the key places. I'm not going to sing a hymn unless it's 200 years old. I'm not going to sing a hymn unless it was written in the last 2 weeks, sort of thing. And you see both of those extremes. I don't think there's any, like, it would be wonderful if we had how to fix these problems in 3 easy steps. And sometimes I'm tempted to write a book, How to Fix This Problem in 3 Easy Steps, because those are the books that we want to read that would sell really well, as opposed to the books that just ask us to think deeply and constantly be encouraging each other and getting to know each other and listening to each other. Unfortunately, it's the being attentive and getting to know each other and listening to each other and thinking deeply that are the answers to the questions, and not here's 3 easy steps to avoid either antiquarianism or the opposite extreme. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think it can be done by people who care and live in community and listen to each other and listen to other voices and are willing to have a piece of art that you don't necessarily understand, but that's really meaningful to somebody else. This may be really odd to say, but that love might actually be really helpful in that. Attentiveness, listening to other people, community. I began the talk by talking with community, and I think that's a really central answer to this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matthew, thank you so much for being here tonight. Round of applause, please. I didn't do much for you tonight. I was just sitting here really close hearing all these answers and feel very enriched by the conversation. Thank you for your questions. Know that we'll be here. It looks like my wife wants to say something in a second, but the building will be open for probably another 30 minutes or so. I think there might be a few snacks left. There's definitely some drinks left if you'd like to hang out. please try to meet somebody who you might not know and maybe share a highlight from the talk, the conversation. That would be great. Matthew has books that he has generously put a proposition out there in front of you. Do what you will with that. Art House has the books that you will need to participate in the rest of the series. Those are on one of the tables out front. They are for a donated cost, but I like to always say take them if you'd like. $8. My wife says $8. If you'd like to take them, we made them so you would read them, so please take them. These are... Yep.
So, a donation, we are so thankful, but they are yours.
And if you
Great.
only have $8, take my book free and give the $8 to our house.
Deal.
If you would like to continue this conversation, tomorrow morning we are hosting a creativity workshop that Matthew is hosting. It is a deeper dive into what we've talked about this evening. We have 5 seats left. So you can sign up outside there if that is interesting to you. It's tomorrow morning at Vellum, at Live at Vellum. It includes breakfast and really wonderful people. So ask questions if you want to get signed up. Just let us know.
Perfect. So far we have 5 seats left, which means there are 45 people attending in the morning for the workshop. Yes? Great. Parting thought?
Thank you all.
All right. Well, hey, friends, thanks so much. Again, take my challenge, meet somebody if you will, grab a drink, have a conversation. We'll see you again soon.